Welcome back. In the last lesson, we started using Vuetify components like AppBar and Footer. In this lesson, we're going to enhance our app further by adding multi-page navigation, taking a deeper dive into component documentation, and learning how to use more complex components. Let's open our project in the terminal to get started. Managing navigation with Vuetify is no different than any other Vue app, since all we need is Vue Router. In this course, I'll be going over the basics of how to use Vue Router, but for a more in-depth explanation on how it works, be sure to check out our course, Real World Vue. We'll start by installing Vue Router with Vue CLI's plugin system, Vue Add Router. When requested for history mode, we'll go ahead and say yes so that we can have standard URLs without hashes. Once it finishes installing, let's start up our local web server. When we refresh our app to see what has changed, it looks like all the work we did last lesson was gone. Oh no! Not to worry though, this is why we use version control. Let's jump into the source control tab in VS Code to see what happened. When we look at the diff for app.vue, you'll notice that all of our work was replaced by Vue Router's boilerplate code. So let's go ahead and discard our changes to revert everything back. And with that, everything looks back to normal. Whew! Thank goodness for version control. Now that we have Vue Router installed on our app, let's refactor our app by moving our login module to its own page. We'll start by creating a new login.vue file in the views directory and create the single file component scaffold. Then we'll cut and paste our login module from app.vue into our login view file and fix the indentation so everything looks great. Before we move on though, we also need to move the data property show password so that everything still works. Our app is blank at the moment, but this is expected since there is nothing in the content for app.vue. Let's configure our login next. We'll open router.js and configure a new object with a path of /login, name login, and for the component, we'll use an anonymous function to import the login component so that it only loads when the user hits the route. Now, when we try to visit the login route, it still appears blank. The reason for this is because Vue Router needs a place to output the component that it's rendering. So we'll go ahead and jump back into our app.vue file and add the router view element so that Vue Router can render the correct content when visiting the route. And with that, our login page renders correctly. When we check our home page route, we'll notice that there's an extra Vue logo sitting awkwardly in the corner. So let's delete that by going to home.vue and deleting the image on line 3. Looks great. Now that we have our app routing properly, the problem is that our Vuetify buttons in AppBar and Footer are not functional. More importantly, even though they're called button components, we still need them to render to the correct HTML based on its semantic usage. That is, if it's a link, it should be an anchor tag, for example. Let's jump over to the docs to see what we can find. When we go to the API section in the docs, there are two particular props that we'll be interested in. The first is href, which ensures that the component is rendered as an anchor and applies the href attribute. However, since we're using Vue Router, we'll want to use the router link element. And so when we search the API docs with router and scroll down a bit, we'll find the prop to, which denotes the target route of the link. This is exactly what we need. Let's jump back into our code and configure our buttons. We'll start by routing home to the index page, and we'll route login to the /login route. As you'll notice now, when we click, everything works as expected. Once we configure everything, you'll see that Vue Router is keeping track of which page we are currently on, and Vuetify is updating the styles accordingly with no extra work. Awesome! However, our footer buttons still don't work. And while we could simply configure the footer button separately, this would mean any changes to the navigation in the future would need to happen in two separate places. So let's refactor our code so that the app bar and footer buttons use the same data property. We'll start by converting our links to be an array of objects rather than strings. Each object will have a label for what's rendered to the user and a URL for routing purposes. We'll notice though, the footer buttons now render the whole object, but that should be expected because it was previously just rendering a string. So we'll go ahead and update that property with link.label, and we'll go ahead and configure the to property with the URL. We'll go ahead and update the key so that it uses the ES6 template syntax so that it's unique from the header when we configure it in a little bit. As you can see now, when we toggle the to, both the footer and app bar are in sync. Let's go ahead and refactor our app bar buttons. We'll start by putting all our attributes on separate lines to make it easy to read. We'll then give it the v-for directive to loop through the links data property, and give it a key using the same ES6 template syntax with header link for a unique key. We'll configure the to property with link.url and display it with link.label. Looks great. With our refactoring complete, it's time to create the main page that our app needs, the dashboard page. For our dashboard page, we have the following requirements. We need to be able to display a table of data. A user should be able to sort the data in the table. A user should be able to set how many rows are displayed, paginate through the data, and be notified when a row is clicked of what they've clicked on. Let's jump into the docs to find the components that we need. As we scroll down in the UI component section, we'll notice that there's a table section. Let's go through and see what they have. Data iterators looks like just a series of cards based on a list of data. That's not quite right. Simple tables appears to be just a wrapper with styles applied, so not this one either. Data tables, however, looks promising. We can see that you can sort based on ascending or descending. You can set the rows per page. You can also paginate. So this looks like what we need. So let's go ahead and open the source code tab and copy the example so that we can use it in our app. Back in our code editor, we're going to go ahead and create a new file, dashboard.view, in our views directory so we have a dashboard page. We'll go ahead and scaffold it out and drop an h1 with dashboard in it to make sure everything renders correctly. We'll then jump over to our router file and we'll copy our login object just to make our lives a little faster. And we'll go ahead and replace all the login with dashboard. And with that, we've configured our route. We're going to want to head and update the navigation though, so let's jump back into app.view, and we'll update our links property with a new object with the label dashboard and the URL/dashboard. With that, you'll see that the app bar and footer updated at the same time. Our refactoring is already paying off. Jumping into our dashboard page, let's go ahead and add a div since we can only have one root node. We'll keep our title there. And then we'll go ahead and drop in our data table that we copied from the docs. You might notice that no data is currently being rendered, and that's because the props are looking for data properties that don't exist in our script block right now. Let's jump back into the docs to grab the remaining code that we need. We were previously in the template block of the source code, but now we need the script block, so we'll jump over there. And we'll go ahead and use the copy shortcut to copy the entire block of code. Jumping back in our code, let's paste what we copied from the example. And when we save, everything looks great. Let's go ahead and collapse the sidebar so we have a little bit more real estate so we can dive into what's going on here. For the data table component, there are two key props that you might have deduced, headers and items. As you can see, the headers prop matches to the headers data property, and the items prop maps to the dessert data property in our component. Let's take a closer look at how the headers are configured. Each header is an object, and the two main properties are text, which renders out to the label that the user sees. And then there's value, which corresponds to the key name in the item that you want it to map to. So in this case, for the dessert column, it wants to map to the name property of each dessert item. In addition to text and value, headers can be configured with additional properties such as align, which determines how the content is aligned within the column, and whether or not you want the column to be sortable. For additional configurations, check out the docs. Checking back in with our dashboard requirements, we can now display a table of data, we can sort data, and we can set how many rows are displayed, and we can paginate through the data. The only requirement remaining is that we need to notify the user of what row they clicked on. And while there are many ways to do this, I'm going to introduce you to Vuetify's snack bar component for this requirement. As you can see in the usage section of the snack bar's docs, when we click on the button, it fires a small banner on the bottom of the page. When we jump into the source code, we can deduce based on the example that the V model controls whether or not the snack bar appears or not. Let's go ahead and copy this into our app. We'll go ahead and drop in our snack bar, and we'll delete the extraneous code because all we need is the snack bar itself. Since it needs the snack bar data property, we're going ahead and add that and configure that to true just to make sure something shows up. Great. When we click close, it hides it as desired. But when we click on a row in the table, nothing's happening. In order to fix this, we'll need to dive deeper into the data table docs. As we scroll down to the API section, we're greeted by the standard prop section that exists on most components. However, I want to call attention to the fact that there are multiple sections in this API section. For data tables, we also have slots and events. Events is what we're looking for, and luckily for us, the very first item is what we need, click row, which emits an event when the table row is clicked, and the item for the row is even included. Let's give this a shot. Jumping back into our code editor, we'll set snack bar to a default of false and set our click row event and tie it to a select row method that we'll write shortly. We'll collapse our data property so that it's easier to follow. And then once we define our methods, we'll go ahead and add select row, and we'll configure snack bar to turn on whenever we click. And look at that, huzzah, our snack bar appears. But we still need to show the user what they clicked on. So we're going to go ahead and update the message inside snack bar to you have selected, and then the data property we want to watch will say is current item. Back to our data property, we'll configure current item as an empty string. As with any standard JavaScript event, you have access to the event details. And since the docs told us that it would pass the corresponding table row, we know that we have access to that object that we saw earlier in the data property desserts. So we'll assign current item to event.name to tell users what they selected on. Dessert name appears in the snack bar as expected. Congratulations on completing Components Part 2. In this lesson, we've learned how to configure our app with multi-page routing, we've dove deeper into component documentation, and learned how to use more complex Vuetify components. For this lesson's code challenge, I'll be providing you an employees.json file that I want you to use to integrate as a data source for the data table on dashboard. Then, go ahead and configure multi-sorting on data table so that you can sort by multiple columns. And finally, update snack bar so that it displays the employee name and the title whenever a user clicks on a row. Good luck. Oh, that was so close. Let's take a closer look. Me ma mo 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 mo. Okay. Me ma mo 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 mo.